Morning, good afternoon, good evening. Can you hear me all right? Thumbs up. Very good. Thank you back. My name is Bjorn Bjelsader. I'm head of the Joint Data Center on Force Displacement. It's our second research conference on force displacement and socioeconomic focus. This is our third day. We have a program of 7 academic sessions. We have 2 left. Today we're going to talk about migrant policies and outcomes, and we're going to talk about attitudes. We're also going to have a keynote speech by Ana Maria Ibanez. And then we would have a closing session where we would also do a little bit of looking forward. Just a very, very top line recap. We've had in the first day, we had opening and welcoming remarks by 3 different policymakers / decision makers. We then had a session on cash transfer programs, followed by a session on IDPs. And then we had a policy session with colleagues both from the World Bank, from UNHCR, and from other institutions, which was focused on how do we take research to policy. The second day, we had a second session on the impact of forced displacement. We had a session on innovation in data collection, and the third session on returnees. And then we finished the day with a keynote speech by Ted Miguel, who also offered to have side conversations both before and after with anyone interested, and there was good interest. While I think it's a pretty big ask to come in on a Saturday to sit through a conference, we know that we had close to 800 people who have registered for this conference, and I think it's safe to assume that many of them will not be watching live, but will be watching the recorded version on YouTube. So although we may not have the greatest turnout this morning or this afternoon just now, rest assured that these sessions are being watched by a big crowd and the right crowd. I think I have 3 things that I want to remind you all of. First, we have a survey that we've asked you to fill out. We have a decent answer frequency so far, but I think there are a few more of you could fill it out. Second, we have posed a question, almost a separate survey, on what examples that you have seen where research on forced displacement has translated into real improvements for forcibly displaced and their hosts. And third, I want to remind you all that Ana Maria has offered to have side conversations before her keynote today. So please take advantage. Those of you who'd like, please take advantage of that. So those are my few words that I want to say before we kick it off today. I'm going to hand the floor over to Jeff Tanner. Jeff is a senior economist at the Joint Data Center. He's been with the center since the start, and he will be the one chairing the first session today on migrant policies and outcomes. Over to you, Jeff.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bjorn. Welcome, everyone, to the third and final day of the Joint Data Center's second research conference on forced displacement. I want to first thank you, our audience, and our presenters for joining us on a Saturday, as Bjorn said. You know, one of the advantages that we have of doing the conference virtually is that although we, the presenters, have to dress up, at least from the waist up on a Saturday, you at home get to watch in your pajamas. by way of housekeeping, you who are watching can join either on the WebEx platform or on the YouTube live stream. We encourage you to please put your questions in the chat on WebEx. You can also do that on YouTube, although you have to be signed in on YouTube to make that work. But please do put your questions in as they come up. Don't feel that you have to wait for the questions. And then we will get to as many as we can for each of the presenters over the course of the next hour and a half. The first session this morning will focus on migrant policies and outcomes, where we're going to look at 2 contexts in 3 papers with 4 presenters. In our first paper, Life Out of the Shadows, Impacts of Amnesties in Migrants' Life, Sandra Rosso will discuss Venezuelans in Colombia. Sandra is a research economist in the Development Economics Research Group at the World Bank. She joined the bank about a year ago and has focused on forcibly displaced populations and migrants. She's also part of the core team preparing the World Development Report 2023, which is about migration and refugees. Sandra, please.
Thank you, Jeff, for the nice introduction, and for everyone that is here today. Let me share the screen with you. Okay, can you see the screen now? Yes? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Super. All right. Fantastic. So again, thank you very much for the interest in our work. I am delighted to be here. This is one of my favorite conferences, very close to my work and the work of my co-author. So delighted and very thankful to the organizers for putting this together. So the paper that I will present today is joint work with Ana Maria Ibañez, who's going to give the key lecture today, with Andres Moya, who was part of the organizing committee, and Maria Adelaida Ortega and Maria Jose Urbina. And in a nutshell, what I'm going to show you is an evaluation of the impacts of a very large regularization program of Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. So here's how I structured the presentation for today. So let me begin with the motivation. So this map is trying to illustrate the idea that we have been discussing often in the conference, that it is actually the global south that hosts the majority of forced displacement population. So this map is illustrating the share of forced displaced population that is hosted within each country in the world. And the most, let's say, vibrant colors are showing you those countries that host the majority of this population. This includes IDPs and refugees. And so what is interesting is that the countries that host the most number of forced displacement populations are Colombia, Syria, because Syria, of course, has also internal displaced population, Congo, Ethiopia, Yemen, Turkey, Sudan, Afghanistan, Jordan, Somalia, right? And so these are countries that have different levels of development, but that all have also, let's say, issues of poverty and that have their own concerns. And now they are receiving these very vulnerable populations. And so a very important question for us as researchers is, how can we help support these countries continue with their development process while helping these populations? And so most of the evidence that we know or that has been coming up, let's say in the last 5 years, has been very centered on studying the impacts that forced displacement population has over natives, over the hosting populations per se, prices, voting outcomes, education outcomes, health. But there is less evidence on what type of things support refugees. So there's a couple of papers that were presented here, very interesting papers that evaluated the impacts of cash transfers by owner and co-author and Bert Gosler in Lebanon and Turkey. But other than that, let's say the true causal evidence is actually very scarce. And so moreover, there is actually less evidence on what type of programs could help refugees be more self-reliant. In other words, be more independent of aid and start to create their own lives and become, let's say, contributors of development where they are and be more responsible of their lives. And so this paper is trying to measure how actually allowing refugees to have a work permit, a job permit, is going to change those dimensions for them. So we're going to focus on studying the impact of a very large regularization program. As I mentioned, the name is PEP, Permiso Especial de Permanencia. And we're going to try to do a more comprehensive examination of how this program impacts refugees' lives. So we're going to center on the refugees themselves. And we're going to try to kind of move a little bit behind the impacts on hosting communities, which is, of course, very important, but we think has already received a lot of attention from the academic and research literature. So we're going to study the impacts of this program on labor market outcomes, on income and consumption, and general welfare and health. We're going to try to do this not only considering physical health, but also mental health, access to state services, and feelings of integration to the society where they're hosted, which is in Colombia. So how do we contribute to the literature beyond what I have mentioned? So there has been some work studying the impacts of regularization programs, but we call it partial programs. In what sense? In the sense that the majority of regularization programs that exist in the world are actually conditional on the refugees' characteristics. For example, it's only available for those who have a passport or for those who have certain levels of education or work in certain sectors. And because of that, it is really hard to offer a comprehensive, let's say, evidence of the impacts of these programs. Also, the evidence has been focused on developed countries like the United States, Spain, Canada, but very little is known about the Global South, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the area that hosts the majority of these inflows of migrants. And there has been this focus on native communities. One of the, let's say, motivations of this paper was a paper that I did earlier, which I actually presented on the first conference of the JDC a couple of years ago. This is joint work with Tani Bahar and Ana Maria Ibanez. And what we find there is we study the impacts of this regularization program on the natives, on the work, on the labor outcomes of the natives. And interestingly, we found negligible effects, small to negligible effects, nothing changed. So there was a regularization of approximately 500,000 people, 500,000 Venezuelan refugees, and there was no impact on the Colombian workers. And so that sparked our interest in actually moving forward this refugee agenda and trying to see what is going on. Is it that there's no take-up? Is it that they are not really using this permit for the purposes that were intended to happen? What is going on? And so that's part of, let's say, a paper that sparked this question that we're studying today. And what is interesting about this paper is that it's going to be a large and sudden regularization with no eligibility criteria other than being able to show that you were born in Venezuela. And it's going to be taking place within a country that has a very large informality level. And so this is very common in the Global South. And this is going to map very differently in the effects that a regularization program can have, because refugees could be working already, but they could be working on the informal sector, right? And so we could very much think that they might not be interested in actually moving out of the shadows, because they would have to pay taxes, and maybe they think that's not worth it, right? So that kind of changes the analysis from what we would be considering in a more developed country where informality is very small. And we're going to try to do this in a comprehensive, we're going to try to study the effects of the program in a comprehensive set of outcomes. So let me talk a little bit about the program. So the program, as I said, is called the PEP program. And so it's actually taking place in Colombia. So of course, I think this is not necessary for the majority of audience that is here today, but this is just a snapshot of what was happening in 2020 concerning forced displacement from Venezuela to the rest of Latin America. So Venezuela has been experiencing a dramatic humanitarian crisis, and Colombia, as is illustrated on your left, is the primary host of refugees coming from Venezuela. By December 2020, there were approximately 2 million people hosted in Colombia. And of course, this is only the people that we actually are able to observe and that actually register with UNHCR. But there could be a lot more people that we're not observing. No, so that this is going to be a lower bound estimate of the number of people that are actually living in Colombia. Okay. So let me talk about the program now. So because the arrival of Venezuelan population was so high, actually it spiked after 2016. The government in 2018, the government in office decided that they wanted to do a census and try to measure how many irregular migrants, which I would refer to irregular migrants, are those that do not have the proper migratory document, the migration documents to be in the country, right? So they cross somehow without a passport, and so that's what we call irregular migrants. And the government, of course, observes the regular migrants, but they didn't know anything about the irregular migrants. And it is important to know how many there were in the country for purposes of receiving humanitarian aid and to direct resources in the country to support those populations. So they did the Registro Administrativo de Migrantes on your left here in the slide, and so it's called RAM for like the abbreviation in Spanish. And basically what it was basically a voluntary registry in which people were called in the media, in local stores, through local organizations to come voluntarily unregistered. And this was open between April 6th and June 8th of 2018. And this was not advertised in any way to offer any type of program. It was just advertised as this is just going to collect data. We want to know how many Venezuelans are in Colombia. And it was collected in roughly 440 municipalities. Colombia has approximately 1,200. So these were the municipalities where there were most concentration of refugees, of Venezuelan refugees, or those near the border. Or also there is a group of municipalities here in which the mayors actually wanted to have an approximation of the number of refugees there. So they were also part of this census. And so it approximately registered 500,000 people, individuals. And so it was closed in June 8th of 2018. So the important thing that I want you to remember is that this census was not intended to do anything else than collecting data. The government was just letting people know that they were trying to know how many regular migrants were in Colombia. And then later, the president who was in office decided that he was going to use this census to regularize all the people who were there. So basically, everyone who was there, approximately a month to a month and a half later that this census closed, they were offered the opportunity to apply to this PEP, right? So the PEP was the Permiso Especial de Permanencia, and they could register between August and December. And it turned out that of those approximately 500,000 people, approximately 60% of that population actually applied to get this regularization program. And it was a very generous program. It offered them the possibility to have a legal migratory status, so actually kind of move freely in the country with that paper, and they could work wherever they wanted. And they could access the safety nets in Colombia because they were able to apply to the CISBEN, which is the proximity test in Colombia to target social safety nets. And they would also be able to go to a bank and open an account, for example, with this document. So what do we do? So with this study, we began what we have now called the VENREP survey, the Venezuelan Refugee Panel Survey. And the idea of this survey is that we would like to use this survey to evaluate the impacts that this program has had on refugees. And so what I'm going to present to you today is the results from the first wave of collection for this survey. But this is an ongoing study, and we're actually on the field collecting the second round right now. So the idea of what we wanted to do was basically have some control and some treatment group. Of course, bear with me, we know they are different, but just so that you understand where we were trying to construct our sampling frame. So the control group would have to be regular migrants, right? Those who do not have any permit in Colombia, and the treatment group would have to be those that have a permit. So to find the treatment group, that was the easy part. We know there was a census, and the government had the census, and so they were very generous, and they shared with us data. So we actually had the universe of people who were in that group, and we had their phone numbers, and so we basically just draw a random sample from the representative sample from that census, and we got the treatment group. The challenge was the control group, because you can imagine trying to find an irregular migrant in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, calling them on the phone and beginning by saying, "Hey, are you an irregular migrant?" And they would just hang up. So it was, in all honesty, one of the most challenging things that I have ever done. At some point, I think we tried so many things and we learned so much doing this. But what we ended up doing, the thing that was most successful, was to move through referrals. So a sort of snowballing sample in which we would have referrals from the individuals that we contacted first from the PEP treatment group, the ones that have the PEP, and we ask them, do you know someone that is an irregular migrant that has these characteristics? And more importantly, we actually reach out to all of the local organizations in Colombia. And through them, a lot of them shared with us their databases, and they actually told their beneficiaries and their contacts about our study. And so through them, we are also able to kind of get a more comprehensive sample of irregular migrants. So at the end, our sample is going to have Venezuelan migrants who are 18 plus. In other words, in Colombia, they're adults. This is different in every country, but even in Colombia, it's 18. And importantly, they should have arrived in Colombia between January of 2017 and December of 2018. And this is important for our identification strategy. So we also did a qualitative survey, which I now recommend to everyone that is trying to do any field work, because it changed our view so much. Our instrument, the things that we wanted to ask, the design of our identification strategy, in a sense that what we wanted to do with these surveys was try to understand what were the motivations behind applying or not applying to this type of amnesty, who left, and why do you think there are certain people that decided this was not a good idea to actually apply to such a generous amnesty, you know? And for those who applied, what were the benefits that they got? So we asked all of these in focus, I don't know, in interviews, because there was a COVID pandemic. So we had to do it in interviews. And we learned a lot of things, but I'm just kind of here enumerating some of them. One was that there is high mistrust and fear among refugees because they don't want to be deported, so they fear being detected. Another one is that those individuals that have networks actually have a lower propensity to apply to the program, which was surprising to us. And the reason behind it is that probably they already have the context that they need, that they feel they need to actually succeed in the country. So actually the people who applied the most to this program were the ones who were, let's say, the less connected, which was very interesting. And one very interesting conclusion, but we kind of knew this before, but kind of confirmed, we were able to confirm, is that PEP and not PEP holders have very different characteristics. So of course, a simple comparison of them was not going to be very, very effective in identifying the effects of this program. So here is Colombia. Venezuela is here on your upper right side, and so our survey was representative of the three big cities in which the country had the most concentration: Bogota, Barranquilla, and Medellin. And then there was a representativeness for the rest, the smaller cities in the country that also had a high presence of Venezuelan refugees, like Cucuta, Villa Rosario, etc. Our sample was approximately 3,000 something households, but the clean sample, the one that we were able to use because it had all the answers that we needed, and it actually allowed us to identify cleanly the program, was 2,200 families. Of those, approximately 1,100 were eligible, and 1,122 were ineligible for the program. We actually learned that using Venezuelan numerators was actually good at improving trust from the respondents. And so we actually hired Venezuelan enumerators, Venezuelans who were actually refugees from the crisis. We trained them and we told them about the study. And so they were very compromised with the study because they felt that it was helping their population, and the response rates actually increased a lot by using this group of enumerators. And we also, well, as is normal, we modified the instrument to use day-to-day common words. So Colombians and Venezuelans, we all speak the same language, but it turns out that where certain words are understood in a different way. For example, in Colombia, when you say usted, which is, let's say, the equivalent in French to saying vous, you're trying to signal respect. So all the surveys are actually kind of written in that way. But it turns out in Venezuela, that's actually signaling that you don't trust people. And so when we actually did the survey, all the Venezuelans were like, no, you need to ask us like more, let's say, like if they were friends, like you would ask them like two. And that actually kind of have to change everything when we're about to go in the field. So that was an interesting and funny story. Okay, so how do we actually identify the impacts of this program? So here I want you to focus on the figure on the upper left. And so basically what you have on the bottom is the arrival dates of all the people in our sample. And what you see in the bars is going to be how many people of the families that we have in our sample arrived each week, okay? So what other thing do you see is you're gonna see the date in which the ramp closed. The ramp, remember, is this registry, and to be eligible for this program, you needed to be in that census, okay? If not, you're not eligible. So that's perfect. We had an exogenous reason for people to be eligible for the program, which is unrelated to economic reasons. So what is it? Well, you had to arrive before the census closed, right? That's the only way you could have been registered in that census. And so now the blue line is going to show you the probability of applying, or if you want, the number of families that applied to the, on average, to the program, to the PEP program. And so you can see for the families who arrived before the census closed, the probability is roughly higher than 0.5%, but for those who arrived after the census closed, it's almost zero. Of course, it should have been zero. So we were a little surprised, but there was some irregularities there. We don't know what they respond to, but in principle, they should have been zero. But what is important for identification purposes is there is this exogenous reason, which is the closing of the RAM, which determined that some people had a higher probability of applying to this program and some people did not. So basically what we're going to do is implement what we call a fuzzy RD, which is basically comparing those that had a higher probability and a lower probability, but are very close to that date of arrival. And so because they are very close, we could assume they are very similar. And we're going to show you that they are actually very similar in other characteristics, okay? And then the other two graphs are just illustrating that there is a statistical difference in the probability of applying to the program around the date in which the census closed. Okay, so here for those who have a more, let's say, academic background, we're just actually showing you that there is a continuity in all of the other variables that we observe. So in other words, the validity of these strategies is going to be determined by the fact that the only thing that is changing randomly is this date. Some people actually were able to apply and not apply because the census closed. But in all of the other things that you observe, these households are similar. Okay, and so this is what we're trying to show here. Basically, what we do here is we use all the variables that we observe for people that were in all the variables. Well, we don't observe them, but we ask people about these variables when they were in Colombia before the PEP and when they were in Venezuela before coming to Colombia. And basically they correspond to labor outcomes, family outcomes, ownership of dwellings, number of children, experience, labor experience, etc. So there is quite a bit of them, and you can see them on the paper. What is interesting is that for the vast majority of them, we find no significant differences between groups. In other words, this is a very good experiment. So what we're going to do basically is compare these two groups of people. And another methodology that we're going to use just to illustrate to illustrate and use the whole sample is just to, let's say, a regression, which is going to control for observables, basically an OLS regression, which is a mean comparison of the people who are eligible and ineligible. And in that sense, and we're going to try to control for some of these variables that we observed that I mentioned earlier, and we're going to compare both methodologies. Why are we doing multiple methodologies? We actually have another methodology in the paper. I'm just going to illustrate these two here. But we do this so that you can have an idea of how the coefficients change. What is good about just using this OLS or mean comparison with controls is that we can use the whole sample. So our standard errors are going to become smaller, or we have more precision. And in the RD, the one that I explained earlier, we're going to have larger standard errors because we have smaller sample around the discontinuity. Okay, so we actually structure our paper using a pre-analysis plan because this is a very polemic topic and we wanted to be very scientifically rigorous in the things that we were doing. So we structured it in three groups of outcomes. The first one were mechanical outcomes, in which is like what should change with this program. For the most mechanical things that we could think of were, well, of course, the objective of the program is to formalize people, to have people jump from the informal sector to the formal sector. So we're going to try to see if that actually happened. Access to safety nets, access to financial services, and then primary outcomes. Once you have access to the formal sector, what should be changing in your life? Well, welfare, consumption, income, employment, mental and overall health. And then we also check a vast number of secondary outcomes like reservation wages, your job satisfaction, food security, resilience to COVID, integration to Colombian society. For the sake of this presentation, I'm not going to have a lot of time to kind of talk about them. I am going to be focusing more on the mechanical and primary outcomes. But this is all in the paper. It is about to come out to be publicly available. And of course, the pre-analysis plan was registered and we have the IRB approval for this project. So in a nutshell, what do we find? So we find that the PEP had very high impacts on labor formalization. So originally, when we began presenting the results of this program, we actually said, we find around an effect of 10% of changes in labor formalization. And we said this was very small. And then people who work in formalization, they were just, what? This is great. This is huge. And they started showing us the evidence of other programs that tried to target labor formalization. It turned out this was one of the biggest effects that we observed. So actually, this is a great and very positive outcome. They also improve access to state and financial services. And they have dramatic impacts on consumption to the order of 60%, and the same as income per capita. There are also improvements, dramatic improvements in the wealth index. And the health outcome index is not significant for the RDD, but it is positive. And then for the secondary outcomes, we find some significant results for our mean comparison, but not for the RD. So the results for the secondary outcomes are not robust for all methodologies. Okay, so Jeff, before I continue, I wanted to check with you how am I doing with time, and so I know if I want to dwell into tables or just jump to the most interesting stuff.
I think you have about 4 or 5 minutes left.
Okay, fantastic, super, thank you. So for the first column here, what we're showing you is the panel A is the RD, and the panel B is going to be the OLS regression or the mean comparison, if you will. So what is interesting is, for example, for column 1, you can see the coefficients are very similar, and we actually observe a 10% increase roughly across both methodologies. Cisben axis, which is column 2, is going to represent how many people actually registered in this proximing test. This is a score that the government uses to actually measure poverty in each household. And you need to have this score if you want to apply to any of the social safety nets in Colombia. So actually having the access is the first step in getting access to those programs. So there is a dramatic impact on Cisben registration. Approximately 50% of people who did not have it, of course, actually have it after they have the PEP. And there is also a dramatic impact on access to financial products. So the primary impacts are the most striking that I have ever seen, which is in any program that I have ever evaluated, which is we observe changes in consumption per capita that are very close to 60%. And we also observe changes in income that are very important. And the last one, the last column that you see in the table is showing you that we also actually registered important changes on welfare index. The impacts, for example, on anxiety and depression are negative and they move in the expected direction, but they are only significant for the OLS regression. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. And so this last thing that I wanted to show you before I conclude is directed at actually putting a face to what we're doing. So when we're doing this research, we sometimes, getting into the numbers on the surveys, we kind of forget that the faces behind of our work. And these are 2 testimonies that are very important of how these programs could change the life of migrants. So the first one is one that is an irregular man that was working in Medellin. And so he says, we would wake up at 5 a.m. and we were in the mountains. And at 7 p.m. when it was already dark, we were just finishing covered in mud, wet, because even if it rained, we did not stop. That was the hardest part of this story. Being without a document is very hard. You always lose. And so basically he's trying to say, it is really hard to be an irregular migrant because people have views that basically when you work for them, they just don't have any control on the type of things that they can make you do. So that was a very interesting thing that we learned in the interviews. Another one is a Venezuelan refugee who's trying to open a firm. He speaks English. And so he says, we have tried to get a language academy started, but many doors have closed to us because we're Venezuelan. Many people have told us they are not willing to hire Venezuelans. And so this is the type of people who are going to be affected by this amnesty. So even if you don't jump to the formal sector, just having that document maybe will allow you to actually require your employer to offer you better conditions, or it's going to allow you the opportunity to open a firm in Colombia. And this last one was very interesting. She says she has a PEP now, and so she's saying there is a change because when the police stops me and they ask me, you are Venezuelan, do you have a PEP? When I show them the PEP, their attitude changes. I mean, their face changes in the sense that they say, you're legal, you can go. And then she goes to actually, because when you hear the interview, she actually goes to describe how her mental health has changed so dramatically because of that she now feels less stressed to be kind of walking in Colombia. And so that's another way in which sometimes the impacts of these amnesties are not just on the economic side per se on labor outcomes, but also impact the feelings of belonging and of mental health of these populations. So the conclusions. So the PEP actually grants more access to safety nets and financial services. We observe large effects on labor formalization of approximately 10 percentage points. And just so you have a reference, another program that studied the impact of cutting payroll taxes and see how that actually changed formalization rates only registers a change in labor formalizations of approximately 7%. So this is an important effect. But more dramatically, or the most important thing of this paper is that we observed dramatic impacts in welfare, consumption, income. It's actually 60% changes in consumption per capita, and just so you have an idea to kind of how big this is, there is other research projects that have evaluated the impacts of cash transfers in Colombia, Mexico, and Indonesia, and they found impacts between 0 and 15%. So actually allowing people to have self-reliance and be able to generate their income is more impactful than just giving them money. And I think this is the most important lesson from this paper, that we're moving in the right direction in Colombia, and this is, of course, I think where every country should be trying to put their efforts on. So coupled this paper with what we found earlier, that there are no impacts on the labor market outcomes of natives, this actually makes a very strong case on the virtues of formalization. And so last and to kind of finish, our survey continues. We're on the field. We're collecting the second wave, and so more to come on the medium impacts of this program. So I just wanted to thank you all for the attention, and also thank IPA Colombia for collecting the data, and the funding was provided by the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the University of Southern California.
Great, Sandra, thanks so much. Absolutely fascinating. The 10 percentage point improvement in formalization itself would be remarkable. But I, like you, I don't know of any other program that has had that large of a welfare jump in consumption. That's absolutely remarkable. Certainly newsworthy. So I want to encourage people to please put questions in the chat. While that's happening, I wonder what. So I have two questions for you. One is technical and one is more narrative, if you like. And so maybe I'll start with the hard one. Technical. So first of all, it seems that there is actually a two-step process for registering for the PEP, right? So first, Venezuelans need to answer the census honestly. They need to say, yes, I am in fact, a Venezuelan. And we see from the irregular workers that you just showed that there is, an incentive among some to not answer that census question honestly. And this is not surprising, right? We see this in many contexts all over, where Venezuelans sort of, traumatized, or any refugee traumatized by that displacement experience is less trusting of institutions. So that's the first step. And then the second step is, of course, that they need to register for the PEP, once they are in the census. So I can imagine all kinds of reasons, motivation, trust, etc., that are unobservable in the data, but that would make those people more likely to go through those two steps and to eventually be part of the PEP. Whereas the discontinuity, I'm not sure, tells us anything about either of those two steps in the registration. It just tells us, the discontinuity is just kind of when they arrived. And so those who are in the control group, we would not observe having gone through that self-selection process, the two-step selection process. So I wonder, could you tell us about how you're able to account for that selection process in the fuzzy RDD identification strategy? So that's the one question. The second question that I'm actually far more interested in is this. Colombia is really one of the first countries to be able to do something like the PEP. Can you tell us a little bit about the political economy that led to the president's decision to open this up? Was that affected by research at all, or by numbers, or by persuasion? I mean, it doesn't seem like it would necessarily be good politics. So I wonder what led to that, and in the context of this conference, which is meant to be kind of bridging the gap between research and application, what lessons can we learn from that as we go forward? Thanks.
Yeah, no, excellent question. So on the selection issue, so let me, I think I'm going to let the technical question. Secondly, I'm going to first answer the one on the political, let's say, background that was taking place at the time where the PEP was approved. So it turned out that the first thing I want to say is that in the global south, and this is something that research has found, it is not true that you have this dichotomy between the left and the right, in which the right is very anti-immigration and the left is very pro-migration. That's not as clear in the global south in most of the countries that I have studied. And in fact, in Colombia, it's actually the right government who is actually been supporting the most these Venezuelan refugees. So that's the first important lesson to kind of distinguish. Not all the world works the same. And so actually in the South, other things are happening and that are very context specific. And so this was the right government. Remember also that Colombian and Venezuelans were part of the same country. We speak the same language. We have the same broadly, let's say, cultural traits. And the government was actually finishing, let's say, their term when this was decided. The president received the Nobel Peace when this was closing. So I don't know if that actually made him to, more affected his decision at all. But this was a surprising decision, even for the people who were in the government themselves. So the census was going to happen, and then the census closed, and that was that. And then suddenly, one day, he wakes up and says, okay, we're going to just regularize everyone. And then he left. And this was left for the next government to actually decide whether they were going to continue with this thing. And the surprising thing is that they actually decided to do it and to continue kind of implementing this program. Not only that, but now the government has decided to offer this amnesty to every Venezuelan that is in Colombia. So beginning this year in January, they open up even larger amnesty in which everyone who arrives before January of 2022 will have the opportunity to be 10 years in a regular status in the country, have access to safety nets. So these countries actually moving towards more and more, let's say, liberal policies towards refugees and integrating them. I like to think that what we have done has helped, but of course, we have tried to have a contact with the government and inform them of these studies that we're doing, and hopefully we very much hope that this study that we're doing actually continues to move the government in that direction, because the government is going to change. And so again, let's say the luck of refugees is going to be kind of in question. Like, is this government that comes next going to continue these programs or stop them? So we hope that our evidence is building and kind of supporting that this is actually moving in the right direction, and also like it influences other countries in that same way. And on the selection issue, which is your other question, absolutely. So this is a great question that you have, and there is all sorts of selections of why a refugee that is very distrustful will not be in the census. No? So the most important thing to have into account is that the results that we have in our RD results are going to be conditional, or we're going to be, let's say, a very good measurement of the impacts of the program for those refugees who decided to come and register in the census and that were in the country 2 years after we decided to do the survey. Now, because there is a lot of evidence as to people that actually registered, for example, and left Colombia, and we don't find them. How can we find them? Because a lot of the survey, as I told you, 60% of the people who were in the census actually applied for the program, right? So what happened with the other 40%? We could not find a lot of them. We were only able to find approximately 100 people who were in the census but did not apply. So what happened? A lot of the qualitative evidence suggests that they left. So yes, our identification strategy is going to account for a lot of, let's say, unobservables on the decision to actually register and apply, but there's still a certain level of selection that we cannot account for, which, for example, corresponds to the people who are actually in the census. And that's just, we did the best we could in a very difficult environment.
Yeah, of course. That's great. Thanks. We're almost out of time, but I do see a question from the chat. And maybe this question is more related to your first paper, where you're looking at effects on hosts. But did you see any evidence of, so the first paper was on crowding out in the labor market. Did you also see crowding out in service delivery? Were there any effect on hosts in terms of access to healthcare, education, due to stiffer demand for those hosts?
Right. So we haven't. So we have done the one on labor outcomes. We haven't really studied healthcare, education, the impacts of this program on those. But in principle, Venezuelan refugees should have access to education and health, even without a PEP. The thing, though, is a lot of them were scared to do it because they didn't want it to be deported. So this could have changed that. And we know for a fact that a lot of people who have PEP actually access these services more with a higher propensity. So this is something that I cannot answer right now. But one thing that I can answer answer that is not in that question is that we do have a paper right now that is about to come out in which we evaluated the impacts on political outcomes, which is what you were telling me earlier, Jeff, on is this really bad for the people who approve it, and we find no impacts whatsoever. So this is not surprising. Like, okay, I can understand, and this is a fact. We have also shown that in other research that when the Venezuelans arrived, this created a political backlash. But once they are there, they already were there in Colombia, and there are policies that support them. It is really hard for me to believe that people are so informed that they would know what the PEP is, what the RAM is, how many people are legalized. And so it had a negligible impact. It's a very precise zero estimated impact on pro-social behaviors towards refugees, towards the government, towards belonging to Colombia, and voting outcomes and voting participation. So it's another interesting topic.
Fascinating. Thanks so much, Andrea. We really appreciate you joining us this morning. For a second paper, Emma Smith and Sarah Stillman will present housing subsidies as a poverty reduction strategy using evidence from Jordan's Syria refugees during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ted gave a great teaser to this yesterday, and we're very excited to see this. Emma Smith is a current PhD student at the Harvard Kennedy School with a focus on development and political economy. She has a regional focus in the Middle East and East Africa. While Sarah Stillman is joining us from Kenya. She's a research coordinator at the Center for Effective Global Action, which is affiliated with UC Berkeley. So I think over to you first, Emma.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Can you hear me all right?
We sure can, thanks.
Great, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here today. I'm quite happy to have the opportunity to present this project along with my colleague, Sarah Stillman. We actually really had the pleasure of presenting the design of this project 2 years ago at the first annual Forced Displacement Conference. And it's just really a great opportunity to be back today to talk about some of the early results that we're finding. So today we'll be talking about the impact of housing assistance on Syrian refugee resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic, preliminary evidence. As I said, this is a joint presentation of myself, Emma Smith, and my colleague, Sarah Stillman. And this is joint work with a large and wonderful team, many members of whom have actually already presented at this conference, Sam Leone, Ted Miguel, and Sandra Rozo. Thank you.
So as many of you know, by day 3 of this conference, there are approximately 26 million refugees worldwide. And of these, about 85% are currently residing in low and middle income countries. But one of the motivating facts for this study is maybe a lesser known fact that about 18 million of them, or 2/3, reside not in camps as we maybe picture them, but in host communities. And despite the fact that such a large proportion live in host communities, there's limited research to date on how best to support these refugees renting housing in the private market. And the need for evidence becomes even more acute during the COVID-19 pandemic, where people are confined to their homes and experiencing financial distress. So this project is a randomized impact evaluation of a humanitarian organization's housing assistance program for Syrian refugees in Jordan. And the housing intervention is similar to many well-known programs in the US that you might be familiar with, like the Moving to Opportunity and Family Options studies. But this RCT is the first, to our knowledge, focused on LMIC refugees. So our study takes place in the context of the Syrian civil war. So beginning in 2011, there was large-scale displacement of Syrian refugees, with approximately 6 million currently living abroad, predominantly in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And Jordan, which is the country of focus for this study, currently has about 700,000 registered Syrian refugees, which make up about 6.5% of the country's population. And similar to the global breakdown, the vast majority reside in host communities, with only about 15% living in camps. For reference, this is what the exterior of an average Syrian refugee dwelling may look like. And this is a picture of an interior of a kitchen. And so today we're going to talk about the effects of a sizable rental subsidy on refugee life outcomes. So including things like economic well-being, health, and education. In parallel, we're also working on collecting a panel data set among a representative sample of Syrian refugees in Jordan, which is what Ted talked about yesterday in his keynote. In the next few months, we're also going to be looking at the effects of rental subsidies on host community outcomes like social integration. And so this study, for the study, we partnered with Norwegian Refugee Council to randomize their oversubscribed urban shelter program. And basically the program provides about $2,200 US towards rent-free housing and repairs. And so this on average covers about 9 to 18 months of rent for these Syrian refugee households. And there are also physical repairs to the household that include things like mold removal, securing windows and front doors, installation of doors to bathrooms, and covering cement floors. And so to address concerns about randomizing in a humanitarian context, eligibility for the program was determined via a vulnerability score, or eligibility for the study rather, was determined via a vulnerability score that was calculated by NRC to include things like household size, but also current economic and housing circumstances. And then looking at that distribution of vulnerability, the 10% most vulnerable were automatically provided assistance but excluded from the study, while the least vulnerable 10% were also excluded from the study and from assistance. And then that middle 80% of households were eligible for the study. Randomization for the study took place at the locality level, of which, so the randomization was in the 2 northernmost governorates of Jordan, just south of the Syrian border, and there are about 334 localities in these 2 governorates. And together, Erbil and Mafraq contain 40% of Jordan's Syrian refugees. And so just a quick note on timeline, randomization was on a rolling basis starting in August 2019 and concluding in March of 2020. And the implementation of the housing subsidy itself began in September of 2019 and continued until fall of 2021 in some cases, kind of depending on the duration of the assistance that they received, with a brief pause from March 2020 to April 2020 because of logistical concerns around COVID-19. And then concurrently, so in August to September 2020, we conducted a round of midline phone surveys. So at this stage, everybody in our survey or in our study had been, the treatment had been receiving assistance, although not everybody had received the full course of their assistance. But then in late 2021, when we went back to collect full in-person surveys, everybody had, for the most part, received the full course of their assistance, and some were almost a year out from the time that assistance had ended.
Thank you, Sarah. So as Sarah was mentioning, we randomized across communities, and that was our intended design, and happily the implementation of that randomization worked out well. We were able to do that and achieved baseline balance on 17 of our 18 pre-specified covariates. We had a modest rate of successful enrollment in the program, and so take up of about 34%. So what this means is that conditional on being assigned to treatment in our program, or in our study rather, about 34% of those individuals ended up actually being enrolled. And the reason for this, as you can imagine, was not typically the fact that a refugee household wouldn't want the assistance. It was rather came from typically either logistical constraints regarding the physical structure of the house. So part of the NRC program, as Sarah mentioned, was partly just a direct rental subsidy, but it was also partly a repairs subsidy. So funding the physical repairs to the house. And so if for whatever reason it wasn't possible to implement the repairs that NRC felt were necessary, then they weren't able actually to implement the program for that household. Then also there were some instances where the landlord was not willing to negotiate with NRC to have this program implemented. So there's sort of an interesting point here, which is that, as Sarah mentioned, individuals or refugee households had a vulnerability assessment done, which then deemed them either eligible for the study or not. But that whole assessment just took place with the refugee household. And it was only after the household was actually offered assistance that NRC then contacted the landlord to try to negotiate with them. So in some of those instances, they just weren't able to reach an agreement with the landlord. Nonetheless, the 34% take-up provides more than enough compliance to be able to have a strong IV for the instrumental variable analysis that we're looking forward to showing you today. First, let me just start by giving a bit of an overview of the survey rounds that we collected that Sarah alluded to. So in between August and September of 2020, we conducted a sort of midline phone survey where the goal of this survey was really to understand how the assistance which refugee households were receiving really at that moment in time. They'd either been receiving it for about 12 months or had just started receiving it within that range. How this assistance was helping kind of provide resilience to them in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, even in our second round of results now, these results are still collected during the pandemic, but we are really interested at that point in 2020 to see, is this assistance enabling households to weather this critical moment more easily? Luckily for that survey, we were able to achieve a pretty high response rate despite it being over the phone. We got a survey rate of 86%. Which provides us with a pretty strong sample. That again, I'll be showing you some of the results from that data in a little bit. Then about 1 year later, between September and December of 2021, we conducted a full end-line in-person survey. And here we again managed to survey over 80% of our participants. We had no significant differential attrition between treatment and control. The purpose of this end line was to collect a far, far richer set of outcomes. This in-person survey lasts usually about an hour and a half in length, and it really covers almost every imaginable topic that you could envision to try to understand both, the economic, social, health, mental health, all of these dimensions of well-being of the households. Now, as you can see, this survey just finished in really last month in December of 2021. So these data are very fresh from the field. We're nonetheless actually excited to show you sort of a preview of results today, but I really want to underscore, and we'll continue to underscore throughout the presentation, how preliminary these results are. We're just starting the analysis, and we look forward to having more robust and certain results to talk about in the future. I also want to mention that for this year, we're actually planning another round of data collection where we're hoping to be able to estimate the longer run effects of this assistance on the households that received the assistance. And we're also interested in understanding aspects of social integration and identity between not just the program beneficiaries, but also the Jordanians. So here, in fact, we're specifically thinking of surveying or planning to survey the the Jordanian landlords of the beneficiary households. And then additionally, the hope is to survey Jordanian neighbors of the Syrian households. So here the idea is that, yes, we were already measuring how this program helped the refugee beneficiaries themselves, but how is this program also affecting all the other individuals who the program impacted? So we'll look forward to having more on that in the future. So diving into the data, let me show you a bit of a snapshot of what this sample looks like. So what I'm showing you here are data that were collected post-treatment, but they're of the control group. So we can think of this as being just sort of a without treatment snapshot of the situation of this sample of individuals. And so one thing that really jumps out at us, first of all, is looking at annualized income. We can see that during the COVID-19 lockdown, which occurred in Jordan in the spring of 2020, which was like a very strict lockdown, people were largely confined to their homes. And we see that this had a dramatic decrease in earnings of households at that time. We do nonetheless see that actually households did manage to recover quite a bit of their earnings once that lockdown was lifted. We also see these households are spending on average just shy of $1,000 a year on rent. And we also see, looking at mental health, that very sadly, depression is actually the norm in this population, or at least symptoms of depression. So what we've used here is the CESD validated scale, and a score of over 10 on the CESD is typically considered an indicator for likely clinical depression. And we find that in our control community, or in our control group, that 56% of respondents have symptoms of clinical depression. We also find, also somewhat discouragingly, that children's involvement in learning activities is actually not the norm. So in the control group, about 22% of respondents report that the children in their household did any learning activities in the past 24 hours. So with this sort of snapshot of what this sample looks like in mind, I'd love to dive into some of the results. To give you sort of an overview of what we find, at midline, we find that treatment households did indeed experience enhanced housing quality, which is great. That was sort of the mechanical intended effect of the program. And we also find some kind of surprising great impacts, one being that there are more children in the household. So here this is actually household size increasing as a result of, as a impact of the program. And we also find higher participation in schooling among the children who are in the household. We also find lower credit usage, suggesting more financial stability, though there's no impact on labor supply. Unexpectedly, and Ted actually sort of alluded to this yesterday in his presentation, unexpectedly, we actually find a reduction in food security at midline. So what this means is that at midline, these households that had received this large subsidy through the form of rental assistance, actually seem to have less food security. So I'll show you those results in a little bit and try to talk a little bit about what we think perhaps could be going on there. Our very, very preliminary endline results indicate that there are some effects that do persist. So at endline, we're serving households typically about 12 months after they've received assistance. For some, the assistance is just finishing. But we're serving them up to 12 months after their assistance is finished. And yet we find that still these treated households do have lower out-of-pocket housing expenditures. And we also find that the increase in child schooling persists. So these are some great positive impacts that, like I said, do persist into the end line. On the other hand, there are some effects that do dissipate. So for example, the differences in housing quality, household composition, and credit usage do all dissipate in our end line results, at least according to the analysis so far. Likewise, our very preliminary analysis does seem to suggest that the consumption and food security effects, those negative effects that we were seeing at midline, seem to have dissipated by endline. So let me show you some of these results directly. So starting with our midline results.
6 minutes left, just so you know, just for pacing.
Perfect, thank you. So starting with our midline results, as I mentioned, we have this normalized housing quality index, and what we're finding here is that, in fact, the housing has improved for these households. For example, they're more likely to be able to lock their dwelling. We also find that there's no direct impact on the housing expenditures that are being spent at midline. And this makes sense, right? Because NRC is subsidizing the rent. So you wouldn't necessarily expect the rent to have gone down. If anything, perhaps it could have gone up if the landlord negotiated well. So here we're finding no significant impact. Then moving on to the effects on housing composition, we find the household size increases specifically due to children or minors joining the household. And we also see that those minors who are in the household are about 16 percentage points more likely to report having done learning activities in the past 24 hours. We also asked about credit usage, or the likelihood that the household had to take out a loan, and we asked about 3 different periods retrospectively. We asked them about before the COVID-19 pandemic began. We asked them about during that strict lockdown period that I was talking about in the spring of 2020. And we asked them about the period from that lockdown, when that lockdown had ended, up to the time of our survey, between August and September of 2020. And in all 3 of those periods, we find this persistent decrease in the likelihood of needing to take out a loan, suggesting increased financial stability throughout that time. And then lastly, thinking about these food insecurity results, we find that in our treated households, respondents are more likely to report having gone hungry at least once in the past 7 days, which we indicate as food insecurity. And the households also self-report that they have actually received less food assistance. So unfortunately, we can't say for sure what we're picking up on here. What we can say is that, the food insecurity result, we can kind of understand perhaps through two different lenses. One is the increase in the household size through minors. And we actually dug into that data more, and we realized that specifically that increase was driven by males ages 13 to 17. So essentially adolescent boys. So as you can imagine, adolescent boys can eat quite a bit. It actually wouldn't be unreasonable that, that statistically significant increase in adolescent boys could actually, make it so that there's less food available for everyone in the household and increase food insecurity. This decrease in food assistance at first suggested to us that perhaps by receiving this form of shelter assistance, households were then screened out of other forms of basic needs assistance. However, we've looked into this quite substantially and really have not found any evidence for that, either in our midline data or through conversations with NGO partners in the region, nor in our endline data. So we're not sure what was driving this result, but we haven't found any other evidence to suggest that that story really carried out. Just jumping quickly to our endline results, as I mentioned, these are quite preliminary, but nonetheless, as I had said, we don't find any persistent improvements in housing quality. However, we do find that there is a decrease in the housing expenditures. So this would be like the rent being paid by the household. What's interesting about this is that at this point, the housing assistance has ended. And so what we think might be going on here is could be a product of a particular feature of the NRC program, which was that NRC only provided us direct rental assistance for about 12 months. However, they required the landlord in the contract to agree to a given rental rate for 2 years, essentially providing that refugee household with a locked-in rate for an additional year beyond the subsidy. And so it appears that perhaps, and we hope to look into this more, but perhaps rental rates have been increasing, but the beneficiary households haven't been subjected to those increases. As I mentioned, we see that the effects on household composition do not continue into, beyond the treatment period, suggesting perhaps people, allowed friends or relatives' children into their household while they were receiving this assistance, but that sort of agreement perhaps ended once the assistance ended. We do nonetheless find that children who report being a student in the household are more likely to have attended all 5 days of school of the last 5 school days. We find that there's no continued effect on either the probability of needing a loan or the amount of a loan that treatment households take out, but we do find some small suggestive impacts on increased financial stability, in that the treated households do report being more likely to have 30 Jordanian dinar, which are roughly equivalent to $50, saved and available should they need it. So just to conclude, we do find at midline that this housing program, which was intended to both reduce the rent that beneficiaries were paying and also improve their housing circumstances and like the physical quality of their shelter, did in fact improve their housing infrastructure. It reduced their credit usage and debt accumulation, and it also caused this increase in household size, presumably due to having the movement of friends or relatives' children into their household during the time of assistance. There are some negative reported food security effects during that time of assistance, but those effects then dissipate afterwards. And meanwhile, we do find that this positive effect on child schooling does persist. In terms of what we hope to have upcoming, we are intending to collect detailed in-person data on attitudes and social integration later this year, and we're looking forward to presenting more of those results as well as more analysis of the latest data in the future. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Emma and Sarah. Again, reminding our participants to please put a comment in the chat or a question in the chat. But I get to start. So first, I think it's fascinating that this is that has echoes of the first presentation that we heard in the conference that Bert gave on Turkey and the conditional cash transfer there, wherein he found that there is a reallocation of children into beneficiary households. And we sort of see something similar here. I think that's just a fascinating trend that I wouldn't have anticipated ex ante, that we would sort of see that consistently. I think interesting here is that it looks to me, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting the results, it looks like extra household teenage boys or early teen boys are being sorted into the beneficiary households, but then those boys then go on and they attend school. And so I wonder if that may have been the intent all the way along, is that, hey, you know, Uncle so-and-so has a house, why don't you go over there? You have a stable place where you can then attend school. And so the intent might have never been around consumption. It might have been around trying to educate boys who, you know, traditionally would then go on and are more likely to participate in the labor market. So it might be an investment in boys in that sense. I'm just positing a hypothesis there. I want to ask you though, is this the effects that we're seeing? The effect that we're seeing on housing and on education, could that be described as a pure income effect? Or is there some sort of a value add the NRC program is bringing to this? So this is kind of the give directly question, right? So if you were to give $2,200 in cash directly to these families and just say you can do whatever you want with it, or even frame it and say this is $2,200 that is supposed to be used for housing, and we've seen that the behavioral science sort of backs up that, you know, framing, you know, does have an effect on people doing what you want with these kinds of things. What I know that you weren't asking that question specifically here, but based on your proximity to the program and its implementation, give us a sense. You know, would families have done just as well had they been given cash? Is this an income effect, or is the NRC actually bringing something additional of value here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I wish I knew for sure, because I wonder about that as well. So I will point out first that a substantial portion of the assistance was specifically earmarked and had to be used for repairs to the structure. So already this was, you know, they were receiving substantially less than $2,200 as direct rental assistance. In terms of whether we would expect a similar result with cash, I mean, this is a population that has been forced, or the data suggests has been forced to make substantial use of credit, whether that's getting debt through their landlord or getting debt elsewhere. And so I do think that if these individuals were able to get cash in hand, I would have to imagine you would have you would probably have somewhat different results, simply being able to have cash in hand, as opposed to you know, I almost think of this as the subsidy interrupting what could be sort of a credit exchange that perhaps the tenant is having with their landlord already, which is just quite different from cash in hand. Unfortunately, though, it's hard to say in this setting. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
No, I just also wanted to say that I think the unique or one of the unique aspects of this program was that because it's not just the beneficiary, like the refugee household that's benefiting, because the landlord is also benefiting from improved like rental value of their home or the home that they own, then this could also, you know, have different effects than just giving cash directly to a refugee household. For one, like social cohesion, you know, perhaps they think more favorably, you know, on refugees because they're able to work closely with them as they rent. That's one of the reasons why we're looking into doing the landlord surveys in the coming months.
Great, thank you. We have two questions in the chat. One, I'm not going to ask you here. Sorry, Thomas. But if you could go into the chat and answer Thomas's question there, I think we would all benefit from having that answer. I think that's an easier one to answer in the chat. But the one I'm going to ask you to answer now is about social cohesion findings. There's supposed to be some of that embedded in this as well. You didn't talk about that much. Can you just give us a flavor of what that was, and then we need to move on? Thanks.
Sure. Actually, so the social cohesion we expect to collect this year. So we're planning to do those surveys in the coming months, but we have not focused on social cohesion yet in the outcomes we've collected. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thanks
although we do, sorry, we do in the end line data, we have some measures of social cohesion, though it's just self-reported from the refugee side and not from the landlord.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Emma. Fascinating results, and I'm sure that we'd love to have a longer conversation about this, and we'll find opportunities where we can do that. Our third paper today is takes us back to the context where we began. This is reparations as development, with the question mark, evidence from victims of the Colombian armed conflict. So this is more on IDPs, and is presented to us by Arlen Guarin. I hope I'm saying that right, Arlen. Arlen is a PhD candidate in economics at the University of California at Berkeley, who is actually coming out onto the job market this year. And apropos to this paper, prior to coming to UC Berkeley, he worked at the Applied Microeconomics Research Department at the Banco Central de Colombia, at the Central Bank of Colombia. So Alan, we're very excited to hear what you have to tell us about the resolution of this conflict and how that's gone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you confirm that you can hear me, see me, and see the slides, please?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. This is joint work with Juliana Londoño Vélez and Cristian Pozo. Juliana from UCLA and Cristian Pozo from the Colombian Central Bank. It's been fascinating to attend all these conferences. This is my first time here, but I hope it's not the last. In our paper, we study reparations, which are measures that transfer money to victims of human rights violations, including IDPs, to recognize and address the harm suffered. And our main research question is whether these cash reparations can help the governments, help these victims to transform their lives. More than 30 countries have implemented the reparation programs to address the harm suffered by victims, from post-authoritarian Argentina to post-World War II United States to post-conflict Indonesia. And while these reparations have been thought to be critical for recovery and development, there is little or no quantitative evidence on the effects that they have on the individuals that receive it. That's what we do in our paper. We provide, we calculate and we estimate the effects of reparations on victims, and we provide evidence from Colombia, which since the year 2011 has paid reparations to around 1 million individuals that have been victims of the Colombian internal armed conflict, and in the form of lump sum payments that can be remarkably large, up to $10,000 at the market exchange rate, or $26,000 adjusting by purchasing power parity. While we don't have an RCT, we do identify causal effects by leveraging the fact that the program was rolled out in a staggered way over time, and the recipients cannot anticipate the time of the arrival of these reparations. We use event study for most of our results, and we use a before-after approach for one of the outcomes, and we construct a comprehensive national linked administrative panel microdata that links the victims registry, national victims registry, to 9 different national levels data sets on millions of Colombians that allows us to track outcomes over time. On summary of our results, we find that reparations do increase and improve long-term well-being for these victims. We find economically small effects on working conditions, and when we zoom in on those effects, we find that reparations cause recipients to work in better jobs, have higher formal earnings, and make them more likely to own an active business. And they also, after receiving the reparations, have lower healthcare utilization, which we argue is consistent with improved health. And they also invest the money in their children's human capital. We conduct a back of the envelope cost benefit analysis calculation, in which we are in the conservative side. And by doing so, we show that the gains from reparations outweigh the monetary cost, where those benefits are mainly driven by the savings in the decrease on healthcare utilization and the returns to human capital investment. Just to, I'm going to start with a little bit background on the Colombian context. There are around 9 billion victims of the Colombian conflict during the last 30 decades. That is almost 1 in 5 Colombians is a victim of the conflict. 90% of these victims are victims of forced displacement. That is 8 million people, which makes for the largest population shared and number of forcibly displaced people, second only after Syria. The conflict was widespread, with more than 90% of municipalities suffering some types of victimizations, and it was mostly rural and affected poorer individuals, such that by 2010, the average victimized household had 5.1 members, had 54% women, and was substantially poor, with only 50% of the individuals working, and making the whole household less than what a person working for a full-time with a minimum wage salary will make in the formal sector. They are even poorer compared to a poor Colombian. The government has tried and the Colombian government has attempted to provide humanitarian aid and help to these victims, and registered the information about these victims over time. But the most ambitious attempt was the victims law, which is a victim, which is a law that was introduced in 2011, and it was really ambitious as it attempted and it aimed to compensate with financial reparations more than 7.4 million victims of the Colombian conflict that had been victimized over the past 30 decades by guerrillas, paramilitary groups, and state forces. By 2021, this program has delivered reparations to around 1 million individuals. And these reparations consist of a transfer of a one-time lump sum and non-means tested cash award that can be remarkably large, as I was telling you, up to $10,000 at the market exchange rate, with an amount that depends on the type of victimization. And given how poor these victims are on average, these reparations represent more than 6 years and an average adult victim's income. The government introduced most like a level cash transfer in these reparations as an opportunity for individuals to transform their lives. The government suggested victims to use the money to attend college, create or strengthen small businesses, and improve or acquire housing conditions in the case that they already had one to improve it. And importantly, what we use for identification is that due to the budget and operational constraints that the government was facing, the payouts of these reparation programs were staggered over time, and they were unanticipated by victims, a fact that is backed by anecdotal and survey evidence, but that we also test empirically with the data that we have access to. This is how receiving the reparation looks to the receiving victims. They receive an unexpected call from the victims unit. The caller instructs the victims that they're going to have an important meeting in around 1 week. No information is revealed about the reparation regarding the reparation. However, at that point, 1 week after the meeting, or like when they receive this call, they may expect that this is going to be related with the reparation. The victims arrive to the meeting, and during the meeting, they are told that they're going to receive the reparation, and they are given a letter. The letter includes a message with the date when the reparation check can be collected and a message about the meaning of the reparation. This is a picture that was taken in one of these meetings that I was able to attend in the first minutes of the meeting, where they are being told that they are going to receive the check and they're going to be able to collect this reparation in a bank in the next in about 1 week. And this is the letter that they received, and let me read it to you. It says that as the Colombian state, we deeply regret that your rights have been violated by a conflict that never should have happened. We know that the war has differentially affected millions of people in the country, and we understand the serious consequences that it has had. It is impossible to imagine how much pain this conflict has caused. However, from the victims unit, we have witnessed conflict survivors' capacity for transformation over these years. We have witnessed their spirit to keep going, their strength to raise their voices against those who have wanted to silence them, their ability to rebuild their lives. For these reasons, with your help, we are working so that we can live in a peaceful Colombia, since it is the victims who actively contribute to the development of a new society and a better future. And these are some quotes from the beneficiaries that attend those meetings, in which they basically claim that while these reparations are not compensating the pain and they cannot repair the pain that they feel for the lost family members, they are an opportunity to move forward and to transform their lives. As I was telling you, we use for identification the fact that these reparations were unannounced and that individuals are not able to predict the arrival of the reparation, and that the program was staggered over time. And we use this and we do it by using event study approaches, in which we compared outcome Y for individual I at time T, and we regress that to individual and time fixed effects, and to event time dummies, for in which case the capital DIT case here represent a dummy that takes the value of 1 K times after the reparation has arrived, with K taking negative values and taking some negative values to allow us to check for our identification assumption of parallel trends in which case we're going to show that before the arrival of the reparations, the individuals that are going to be treated are not different or systematically different or behaving systematically different compared to those that are about to be treated or those that are eligible to be treated and have not received the reparation. We cluster the standard errors at the household level since some of the reparations arrive at the household level, and the main comparison of victims are going to be between those that are treated in our time of study, which is from 2011 to 2019, and those that are soon to receive the reparations, and those that are going to receive it, that are eligible to receive it but haven't received it in the period that we analyze, which are the never treated individuals. To understand the impacts of reparations, we take a look on three different types of outcomes. We take a look on the impacts on work, health, and human capital. We start by the impacts on work. While the standard labor supply model will predict that a cash arrival like this will decrease labor supply, the evidence from the developing economies and from development literature shows us that these type of cash transfers don't seem to cause distortionary effects on labor supply. So when we try to take a look on this, and let me explain this graph for you, because this is going to be the way in which we're going to show most of the results in this presentation. Here we have an event study results, for which on the vertical axis we have the percent effects relative to the control mean, and on the horizontal axis we have event time, where to the left of this this dashed red line we have the pre-event time trends, for which we show that there's no significant difference between those that are soon to be treated and those that are the never treated population, which shows us evidence in favor of our identification assumption. However, we see that after receiving the reparations, individuals are indeed less likely to work in the formal sector, and the effect is 3.3% 1 quarter after receiving the reparation. And it is kind of permanent over time, such that 3 years after receiving the reparation this year, this effect is about 1.6%, and it's significant. While we are able to detect significant and negative effects, this effect is economically small, as it only represents a 0.3% percentage points drop in the probability of working in the formal employment. When we zoom in on these effects, in these small and economically small formal employment effects, we find that they're mainly driven by wage earners that are shifting out of jobs that are high in risk and low pay. That is, that jobs that pay close to the minimum wage. And also, when we try to see what is explaining this permanent drop, we see that individuals over time are using the outside better alternative that is given by these reparations to have longer out of formal employment spells that allow them to have higher daily wages over time. While this initial increase in daily wages is driven by the fact that these individuals are quitting jobs that are low in pay, over time we see that while the drop in formal employment has stabilized, the increase in the daily wage can be seen over time, such that 3 years after receiving the reparations, even though individuals work for a lower amount of time in the formal sector, the overall formal and total formal earnings in minimum wages is larger, an effect that is mainly driven by the fact that they are earning more daily wages. This drop is also explained by individuals taking some occupations outside of the formal labor market. When we take a look on what are the effects on business creation, we find that individuals are 37% more likely to register a formal business with the local chamber of commerce the quarter after receiving the reparation, showing that there were some financial constraints that were not allowing these individuals to create these own businesses. And this money not only allows these victims to create businesses, but also it allows them to this business to survive over time, and the ones that were created before the arrival of the reparations also survive over time, such that 3 years after receiving the reparation, individuals are 14% more likely to have an active business. And this is an effect that remains and is constant and is kind of permanent over time. Consistent with higher entrepreneurship, we also find that the individuals have a larger access to microcredit in the extensive but also in the intensive margin. 3 years after receiving the reparations, individuals have a higher use of microcredit, a use that is healthier use of microcredit, as the number of days delinquent on this type of microcredits is lower, and that negative effect persists over time, an effect that we were able to check using the census of formal loans for the whole country. We take a look on consumption, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but we do explore these results on the paper, and we do so by taking a look on the information from the census of formal loans. Using inferred consumption from credit card use, we find that reparations increase this consumption through this credit card by 32%. The reparations increase the probability of having an automobile loan by 69%, and by using information about Antioquia, which is a state in Colombia that has 25% of the victims and represents also 25% of the reparations that have been delivered so far. When we take a look on this Antioquia case study, we find that reparations increase the probability of victims buying more land and homes, which is consistent with them being wealthier. So this is evidence that the individuals are able to consume more durables and non-durables, and are also wealthier after receiving the cash reparation. While there are a lot of outcomes that we can
2 minutes left, Evelyn.
Oh, it says that 40 minutes, I think. Am I okay? Well,
I'll give you 3.
Wow. Okay. Perfect. So let me go really quick over the health results. These are results that we expect summarize like a lot of the findings that are related to things that we cannot measure in administrative data, but can indeed affect the quality of the life of these individuals. We argue that these effects are mainly driven in our context by changes that are associated with improvements in health, based on the fact that in Colombia we have close to universal healthcare coverage. We find important effects on decreases on healthcare utilization, especially we take a look on emergency department visits, and we find an immediate, a short-term drop of about 5%, but that effects compounds over time, such that 4 years after receiving the reparation, individuals are 18% less likely to visit an emergency department, an improvement that is consistent across different measures. There is a decrease in hospitalization, there is a decrease in medical procedures, and when we try to take a look at what explains this drop, we see that in the short run, there are conditions that are more related to improvement in working and living conditions, and in the long term, this is mainly driven by more chronic conditions that take longer to be affected by this cash transfer. We also take a look on what happens to the individuals that receive the reparation and what happens to the children of these victims. And what we find there is that individuals do invest in their children, and some of the gap that was introduced by the reparation and some of this intergenerational gap is closed by the arrival of these reparations. Individuals are more likely to invest in the post-secondary education of their children, such that 2 years after receiving the reparation, individuals, the children of these victims are 18% more likely to attend a post-secondary university, with the effects being particularly larger at private institutions, where the financial constraints could have been like a barrier for these individuals to access education in the past. And we do see that the reparations allows individuals and children that were younger when the cash arrived to the household to have a better performance at the high school exit exam, consistent with improvements in this human capital formation. While we don't find evidence on graduation, we do find that they perform better. This effect doesn't seem to be driven by a change in the type of high school attended, and it seems to be driven more by behavioral changes associated with the arrival of the money at the household level. We find that with a very conservative analysis in which we only focus on the things that can be quantifiable, we find that the benefits of the reparations outweigh the monetary cost. But let me summarize this with these 3 results. We find that the savings in health account for around 50% of the initial monetary amount received. The human capital, or the potential returns to human capital formation, could account for 60% of these reparations, while we don't find a significant distortionary effects on work. And let me summarize over there. I think that's pretty much the message that I wanted to give.
you want to go through the concluding bullets, go for it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so basically, we find that that the reparations do improve the individual's long-term well-being, and contrary to the notion that cash transfers fully discourage employment, we observe that there is actually a very small drop in wage employment that is mainly driven by reallocation of workers across jobs with higher wages and increased business survival and increasing levels of consumption for these individuals. We also find that the reparations cause economically meaningful decreases in healthcare utilization, which we argue that in the Colombian context are driven by improvements in health conditions, driven by these improvements in working living conditions. And we do find also that reparations increase human capital investment for the next generation by improving high school scores and also college attendance, which in an analysis where we try to see what part of the gap is closed, we find that those improvements close most of the gap created by the victimization and most of the intergenerational gaps in terms of human capital formation. And our findings then suggest that reparations can be an effective policy tool with the potential to improve long-term well-being to these individuals, and not only be a progressive but also an efficient policy tool.
Great, thank you so much, Arlen. And I want to first congratulate you on moving through a bunch of very dense information there at the end very quickly. Well done. Thank you for that. We're trying to preserve just a little bit of time for people to go on a 5-minute break as we sort of run into our break time. So Ibrahim has a question in the chat, which is kind of a point of information, wondering about the criteria used to identify beneficiaries of the repatriation scheme. Or did the program just sort of cover everyone? How was one sort of found to be eligible, or who was the focus of the program? And then I have a question that's actually related to the very, very last thing that you said, which is that this is not only sort of a good thing to do morally, but it's also economically efficient. Did you guys at the Banco Central, did you calculate an ERR on this, an economic rate of return, or do some other exercise where you're trying to understand the rates of return of this as an investment, apart from being the morally sort of correct thing to do, to look at what the returns of that kind of an investment are? Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah. So on the selection criteria, there are 14 types of victimizations that are covered by these reparations, including forced displacement, including relatives of family members that were murdered or forcibly disappeared, torture victims, victims of landmines, among others. And the selection criteria in terms of who was going to be considered was mainly defined by the victims registry, which is a registry that has been collected since 1997, including information on forced displaced individuals. But individuals were also given a short period of time in which they could go to a local agency and claim that had been the facts leading to the victimization, and that information will be checked against like official records, and they will be given the information whether they were going to be accepted or not in the victims registry. So that was basically the selection criteria. While regarding the internal rate of return, we do calculate a rate of return of around 10%. Well, that's something that we don't want to emphasize a lot, because we can only calculate like a very lower bound of the potential effects, because there are a lot of things that can be happening at the same time. We can only measure consumption of using the formal credit market and formal loans, and we are only focusing on the calculation on this cost benefit analysis on the margins that we can quantify directly from the data, like increases in informal income, increases in profit from the new businesses, and the savings in the health system, and the returns to human capital formation. But there are other margins that can also be affected and could also be should be taken into account, like the actual improvements in health that should be quantified here, and that's why we would like to say that is that's a lower bound for the potential returns on this policy.
Fascinating. That implies many more policy questions with the 10% ERR as a lower bound. That's really quite high. So fascinating to hear. Thank you very much, Arlen, for a truly fascinating discussion. Thank you also to Sarah and to Emma and to Sandra and everyone else who participated and who will watch, and who got up and joined us in their pajamas. We will resume. We'll go on a short 5-minute break. We will resume at 1:45. And at that time, we will be able to hear from in session 7 of our discussion. And I want to also let folks know that session 7, which of course is on attitudes. I also want to let folks know that if you are able to, if you would like to join and have a conversation with sort of a side conversation with Ana Maria Ibanez, she is available 1 hour prior to the start of her keynote. So that will be at 11 o'clock, starting at 11 o'clock Eastern time in the US, at 5 p.m. Central European time. The link to that will be put in the chat, or will be, or you can find it in the email that was sent to you. But again, thank you everyone, and we'll join you in 5.